Greetings. It is Monday, February the 17th, 2025. I'm Thomas Caldwell of the Aurelian Column, and this is the Monday Morning Report. Happy George Washington's birthday, or as it is known, President's Day, although it was originally set aside as a holiday to celebrate George. His birthday, by the way, is the 22nd. Americans love to have national holidays on Mondays because, well, we get 3-day weekends that way. President's Day is an early form of political correctness, thinking that all presidents need to be honored. Well, not all of them. Not all presidents are created equal or become equal by any standards, and some don't even prove themselves worthy to be human, and recent history has demonstrated that most effectively. But anyways, enjoy your 3-day weekend, those of you in the United States, and for those of you in the rest of the world, well, Mondays are Mondays, aren't they? Now, it is a very interesting day and week ahead, and it's been a very interesting week that has passed. First off today, Secretary of State Rubio is supposed to meet Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov in Saudi Arabia to discuss a way to end the Ukrainian war. Well, that's actually angered a lot of people. Mr. Zelensky, the little comedian who runs Ukraine, who no one will ever laugh at again, he's not invited, which is not a real surprise, and the Europeans are upset they're not being included either. Well, considering how much they've wanted to egg this on, I don't blame the current administration for that. The reality is that this whole mess could have stopped very early had Ukraine not been propped up in the way it was. The speech given by Vice President Vance in Munich was quite historic, and of course it angered a lot of Europeans, because we're basically calling them out on the hypocrisy that they are so good at doing. This is a cultural inevitability between Europe and the United States. Anyways, back to the peace talks. They're being held in Saudi Arabia for some reason. I'm not really sure why. But hopefully out of this, there will be some plan that the Americans and the Russians will come to that will lead to an end to this horrible, nasty bloodshed that is the worst that Europe has seen since the Second World War. And the U.S. has every right to have a big say in the matter because they've been paying for this mess for a long time, or I should say the previous administration has. Now, Mr. Vance, to go back to this here, basically outlined an awful lot that Europe needed to hear, the European people needed to hear. The people that run Europe, well, they don't really care. I'm going to have to put something forward that no one wants to talk about, least of all Europeans. The United States fought the Second World War ostensibly to free Europe from tyranny, real tyranny. We were supposed to have shared values that were similar, if not identical. And after the war was won, NATO was formed to protect it from another threat known as the Soviet Union, which is long since gone. But if you think of all the trillions of dollars that have been spent and the many, actually hundreds of thousands of American lives that have been lost in the last 80 years, World War II, and then what followed afterwards. The fact that Europe no longer believes in freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of economic choice, all these other things, well, what is the point of us having anything to do with that continent in terms of military defense? With the money that we have spent propping up Europe and protecting it from significant threats, we could have settled other planets. Now, the previous administration, and also a few others before that, went along with whatever they went along with. it's changed drastically. What you are seeing now is a geopolitical shift of the likes of which the world has not seen since the Second World War. This is even more significant than the collapse of the Soviet Union. The U.S. is not going to be playing these games anymore. The American people are sick of it. And the American people, when they're called upon, are quite strong. And as I like to say, they're patient until they're not. When I read about elections being nullified in Europe, or people being put in prison because they question something about history, or if they are caught praying outside an abortion clinic, and then they're put in jail for that, I want nothing to do with defending that sort of a world, that sort of a continent. Now, let me explain something to my European listeners, of which there are many. People talk about rights, and they don't really understand the rights that are mentioned in the U.S. Constitution or why they're there. They are of the mistaken belief, as are sadly many Americans, that those rights are something the government grants you: the right of freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to keep and bear arms to defend yourself, the right to be secure in your person, the right not to testify against yourself in legal proceedings, etc., etc. Those are not rights that are granted by the government. Those are rights that you are born with, and they are the right of every human being living on this planet, past, present, and future. They're mentioned there because it's the job of the government to protect those rights, not give them or take them away on a whim. Protect them. You're born with those rights too, my European brothers and sisters. Your government should be protecting those, but no, they're deciding whether or not you should have them. So I put forth that, sadly, what the Americans fought and died for during the Second World War has now been lost to your own version of domestic enemies. That's what Mr. Vance was trying to tell you, and he was saying it very politely. That's why you're not involved in these Ukrainian discussions. That's why Americans are seriously asking, why are we spending all this money with all these military bases in Europe? Why? There's no good answer for that. Our ancestors left Europe for a reason, either by force or because they were sick of it. And one of the problems that Americans recently forgot, and now we're getting back to, is merit. Europe was run under a class system. If you were high-born, you would be put in charge of armies, often with disastrous results. If you had merit, well, too bad if you're at a lower level. The U.S. was built on merit, and it's finally getting back to that after a sad relapse. So Europe is now at a crossroads. It can either embrace the freedoms that many of your own ancestors fought for 80 years ago, or you can surrender to cowardice and succumb to these tyrants that want to make you nothing more than cogs in a machine, an economic machine, a political machine where you don't have any say, and all you're going to do is suffer. As a rather notorious member of Europe said, you will own nothing and you'll be happy. No, you won't. Europe has to look to its own affairs, and the people have to fight back. And the people that really need to fight back are the Britons, yes, the United Kingdom. You have a guy named Sterner there who's a nut. I don't know where you pulled him out of, but he's talking about sending quote-unquote peacekeeping troops to Ukraine. Well, there's no peace there right now, so he's just trying to muscle in. There was recently a documentary I saw that Britain has far more admirals in its navy than it does warships. I found that rather humorous. But Britain has done so much over the last century to basically destroy Western civilization. I'm saddened, and I do have very good friends from that island, and many of whom don't live there anymore. No, Europe is going to have to change. It's going to have to go back to aspiring to what Americans decided to become. And you really don't have any choice in the matter. The only choice is slavery, because that's what you're heading into. In fact, it's arguably where you're already at. Now, Canada. Americans love Canada, really. We always love going up there and buying their maple syrup and all sorts of fun things. And it was always a very pleasant place to visit, clean, nice. Unfortunately, there's been some interesting reports that are not yet coming out in mainstream sources. And if they are true, if they're proven to be true, it's going to be devastating for the relations with our neighbors to the north. And that is fentanyl, cooperation between the ruling Liberal Party and fentanyl coming across the border. And that's all I'm going to adhere to. There's been some stuff that's been pretty specific. It just has to be verified. But if that's the case, if Canadian politicians have been profiting off the fentanyl invasion of the United States that has resulted in the deaths of thousands, tens of thousands of Americans, well, that's going to get sticky. That's what they call in the old school an act of war. It's one thing if there's stupid politicians that are letting criminals get away with stuff. That's one thing. But if there's politicians making money off of the killing of citizens of another country, well, that's going to be a little complicated. So look forward to that coming out, if that goes any further. Now, other things happening in the world. Before we head back to the United States, South Africa, yes, the Trump administration is pushing to give refugee status to the Afrikaners, the white South Africans, who are being slaughtered by the monstrous supporters of the African National Congress. About time. Decades overdue. We'll take people from any other part of the world that just want to come here and be so-called refugees, but the white South Africans, many of whom are technically indigenous to that continent, and I'll explain that in a second, have been murdered ever since they got rid of apartheid. Actually, I've met people who said that they were anti-apartheid activists back in the 1980s, and they regret it down to their bones. He said, look what happened. Now, there are places in Africa where white people are citizens, and they're treated very well. But we're dealing with South Africa and the Communist African National Congress, an organization that should be eradicated from the face of the earth, and all of its leadership held for crimes against humanity and promptly dealt with. But anyways, these are hardworking people who had built a first world country and handed it over to others who promptly turned it into a third world garbage hole. Now, why do I say that these particular Africans of white color are indigenous? Simple. When they landed there in the 1600s, yes, way back when, they landed on a part of southwestern Africa where no humans had ever really been. Maybe a couple of hunting parties here and there, but there was no civilization that had ever been there. They were the first. Technically, they're indigenous. In fact, I would say accurately they're indigenous. Of course, the British, remember I was talking about them not too long ago, they came in there and they pushed them into the country, and, it's a long story. The British, by the way, invented the concentration camp. No one talks about that. South Africans are going to be given refugee status to come to the United States, and if they are as good at being farmers here as they were there, we're going to be in very good hands. One South African guy I know said that he would not want to come here for one reason alone, and I said, what is that? I can't imagine living in a country without elephants and lions. Interesting answer. Perhaps we should have some military intervention there to get rid of crimes against humanity. A young student was in touch with me, and he said, did you hear what's going on with North Koreans in Ukraine? And I said, no, what? He said, they're dying. Actually, North Korea, for those of us who lived in the Far East, knew for a very long time, it's more of a paper tiger. It has nuclear weapons now, which, if we had dealt with them in the 1990s, never would have been a problem. But that's a country that should not exist. It's a blight on humanity that the rest of the species has allowed it to exist. The people there are totally enslaved. I mean, why do humans allow that country and the family that runs it to live? I'll tell you why. The Japanese want to see it continue the way it is, and so do the Chinese. Why? Because you have an industrial, developed South Korea and a North Korea full of natural resources. And if they ever got united, they would give Japan one hell of a run for their money, and you would see the same with China. Again, it's all about money. Forget about human suffering. Money. That's what that's about. Apologies to my old Japanese friends, but you know I'm speaking the truth there. Okay, now back to the United States. The U.S. government continues to be audited and investigated by Elon Musk and his team at the Department of Government Efficiency, better known as DOGE. That's going to be a name that's going to live in history, I'll tell you. They're going after everybody. This week it's supposed to be the Internal Revenue Service. They're going to be laying off a lot of people there. For those of you who don't live in the United States, anytime you get a letter in the mail with this ominous, stylized eagle in the left-hand corner that says Internal Revenue Service, it strikes the fear of God, the devil, and everything in between into your heart. Nobody likes them. In fact, I have some firsthand knowledge of when I was young, when people I knew were basically destroyed by the IRS. That was back in Jimmy Carter's day, by the way. Jimmy Carter's Internal Revenue Service in the 70s was arguably the most ruthless and the most evil. For those of you who are lauding the late president, I'm sorry. He presided over a real horror, and I know because I was there. But they're going after everybody, and they are uncovering waste and abuse and corruption, the likes of which even the most cynical of us couldn't have imagined. And I'm not going to bore you with the list here because there's plenty of it. You can find that in other sources. Now, this is leading to a bit of a constitutional crisis. I wouldn't say a bit. It's going to become one because a lot of federal judges who were appointed by very left-wing administrations, even some that have some conflicts of interest, and that, again, is something that will be part of another report later, they're trying to block Trump from doing things. The most interesting case is where a judge says he has no right to look at the accounts of the Treasury Department. The president doesn't have the right to look at the books over at the Treasury Department? Does that sound insane? Yeah, well, it is. But remember, criminals are by nature stupid, and when they are in a corner, they do desperate and even more stupid things. This week, Kash Patel, who is going to be the head of the FBI, he was approved by the Senate committee responsible for such things, and it's going to the floor probably Tuesday. And when it does, and soon as he's sworn in, you have a vicious attorney general and a ruthless, very ruthless, director of the FBI that are going to go after everybody. Members of Congress are wondering what they have on them. Maxine Waters actually said that. We don't know what they have on us. Oh, that's an interesting statement if there ever was one. Expect to see quite a few orange jumpsuits. This is what they're all terrified of, where the money went. Where do you think these people in Congress that come in and are paid, less than $200,000 a year suddenly find themselves worth tens, 20s, 50s of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars? Come on. Everybody likes to get on the Chinese of being tyrants. Well, I've been there a couple of times. One thing I can say in their credit is if they find government officials who are guilty of corruption, they're not dealt with kid gloves. They're executed. The Chinese have a very long history of culture that goes back about 6,000 years, and they know that corruption will destroy everything, just like drugs. Something we haven't learned yet in either case, but, give it some time. Now, we're seeing, as I said, a geopolitical shift in the way things are done in the United States and this world of the most significance since the end of World War II. Now, one thing that was quite good and telling, it might have been a bit of an offhand remark that President Trump made in the White House. He's talking about, why don't we just cut military spending in half? Well, chances are we could do that and keep things the way they are, but at the reality of it, all of the countries of the world are sick and tired of feeding the military-industrial complex because it's all over the place. It's what drove the Ukrainian war. It's what drove the Vietnam War. It's what's been driving all these wars. President Eisenhower warned us about it, but by then it was already too late, and I think he knew that. You cannot put the toothpaste back into the tube, and the genie ain't going into the bottle. Too many Americans have now seen what's going on, and they are not going to stand for it. And like many people, I'm worried that the powers that be, the deep state, which is now in peril, is going to try to do something against members of the current administration, including the president, vice president, and everyone else. And I hope and pray that they are protected. But honestly, if anything happens at this point, I don't think you can change it anymore. Americans are too sick and tired of it all. The price of eggs is going up because of some bird flu nonsense that nobody really believed. That's why people are starting to grow their own eggs again, which is a good American custom, actually. It's a good cultural thing to do. But ladies and gentlemen, you are living through history, the likes of which very few people have been witness to. It's dangerous. It's very, very worrying, but it's also exciting. And it's also necessary. Very necessary. So hold on to your hats and keep your powder dry. And that's not just allegory. This is a country that's going through a massive change right now. The insanity is being driven away. The sun's coming out, but it doesn't come out easily. Europe is at a crossroads. The world is at a crossroads, and it can go into a very bright, brilliant golden age when we're going to be spending our money on developing our own countries, educating our children, and traveling to the stars. Or we can spend it the way we've been spending it and work towards what we've been working towards, and that's heading into an abyss from which there is no escape. My, what a time to be alive. It's times like this where the cowards show who they are and the heroes stand up and are recognized. That's it for today. If you appreciate my work, please like, subscribe, and share. Share with your friends, and especially these days, share with your enemies. And the more enemies you have, the more effect you know you're having. I can be reached at feedback@aureliancolumn.com. That's feedback@aureliancolumn.com. I'm up on X. My handle there is MICCAMPEN, MICCAMPEN. This podcast originates at Substack. My address there is aureliancolumn.substack.com. Until we meet again, be good, be safe, be vigilant, and remember, the deep state and clown world have to continue to be destroyed. Good day.